I noticed the night before my granddaughter's birthday party that something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong yet. My name is Dorothy and I am 67 years old. I have lived in the same house outside of Bozeman, Montana for 31 years. My late husband Gerald built that house with his own hands. Not all of it, of course. He had help from his brother and 2 cousins, but he poured the foundation himself, and he laid every stone on the front walkway by hand, one at a time in the summer of 1993. Gerald passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I never quite got used to the quiet after that. The house sits on 14 acres. We used to run a small cattle operation, just enough to keep the land productive and earn a modest income on top of Gerald's work as a civil engineer. After he passed, I sold the cattle and leased the grazing rights to a neighbor. I kept the house, the barn, and the 2 smaller outbuildings. I also kept the investment accounts Gerald had spent 30 years building carefully and quietly. When I finally sat down with our financial advisor the year after Gerald died, the total came to just over $2 million. I remember driving home from that meeting and sitting in the driveway for a long time before going inside. Gerald had never once mentioned a number like that. He just worked and saved and never said a word about it. My daughter Claire is 41. She teaches 3rd grade at an elementary school outside of Billings. She is the kind of person who remembers every birthday, who shows up early to help set up, who stays late to help sit up, who stays late to help clean. She got that from Gerald. My granddaughter Sophie is turning 7, and Sophie is the kind of child who makes you believe that the world is still fundamentally good. She has her father's dark curly hair and her mother's stubborn streak, and she is the first person in 30 years who made that house feel full again. Claire met Marcus 2 years ago. He was introduced through a mutual friend, someone she trusted, which I think is part of why she trusted him so quickly. He was 44, tall, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who wants to appear successful without being showy about it. He worked in commercial real estate, development consulting, he called it, which I later learned meant he helped identify properties for acquisition. He was good with Sophie. He remembered small things Claire had mentioned. He made her laugh in a way I hadn't seen since before her first marriage ended. The first time I met him, he shook my hand with both of his and told me Claire had talked so much about me. He had a wide smile, the kind that fills the whole face, but I noticed, even then, that when the smile faded, his eyes didn't follow. His eyes stayed busy, moving around the room in a quiet, cataloging way. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was protective of Claire in the way all mothers are protective, and that I needed to give this man a fair chance. The second time he came to my house, about 3 weeks later, he walked the property with Gerald's old curiosity, or what looked like it. He asked about the fence line on the eastern edge. He asked how far the back acreage ran. He asked whether the barn was still in use, and when I told him it wasn't, he nodded slowly and said something like, "That's a shame. Beautiful structure, lot of potential." I didn't respond to that. We moved on. The third time he asked me how long I'd owned the property. I said 31 years. He asked whether I'd ever thought about what I'd do with it eventually. I said I hadn't given it much thought. He smiled again. Of course. No rush on those things. I went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a moment before bringing the tray out. I noticed my hands were very still. Not trembling. Still. The kind of still that happens when something inside you goes quiet and starts paying attention. I want to be clear about something. I didn't act on that feeling right away. I continued to welcome Marcus to family dinners. I watched him with Sophie, and he was genuinely kind to her. I watched him with Claire, and she was happier than she had been in years. I told myself the property questions were innocent curiosity. Men in real estate notice property. It's a professional habit. I talked myself out of my own instinct at least 4 separate times over the following months. Then he asked about my financial advisor. We were having dinner at Claire's house in Billings, just the 4 of us, plus Sophie, who had already been put to bed, and the conversation had turned to retirement planning in a general way, the kind of abstract dinner table topic that sounds harmless. Marcus mentioned that he knew a great wealth management firm in Denver. Very discreet, very good with estate planning for people who had complex holdings. He looked at me when he said it. Not at Claire. At me. I said I was happy with my current advisor. He said with that same easy smile, "Of course. Just want to make sure Dorothy's taken care of. She's worked hard for everything she has." Claire squeezed his hand across the table. I looked at my plate. That night, driving back to Bozeman on the dark highway, I made a decision. I wasn't going to talk myself out of my instinct anymore. I was going to pay attention. Over the next 6 weeks, I paid very close attention. I started keeping a small notebook. Nothing dramatic, just dates and things. Said, things I noticed. I wrote down the property questions. I wrote down the financial advisor comment. I wrote down a conversation Claire mentioned in passing where Marcus had suggested, gently, that it might be a good idea for the two of them to understand the full family financial picture before they got engaged, just to be responsible adults about it. Claire had thought this was mature and sensible. I wrote it down. I also called my attorney, a woman named Patricia who had handled Gerald's estate and who I trusted completely. I told her what I had observed. I asked her to review my estate documents and make sure everything was structured the way I wanted it structured. Patricia listened without interrupting, and then she said, quietly, "Dorothy, you're smart to be paying attention." We spent 2 hours going through everything. I made some changes. I also had a conversation with my financial advisor. I'm not going to share the details of those changes here, but I will say that by the time Marcus proposed to Claire 4 months later, my affairs were arranged in a way that would be very difficult for anyone to disturb. The engagement surprised me only in its speed. They had been together 14 months. Claire called me on a Tuesday evening, crying with happiness, telling me about the ring and the proposal and how it had happened on a hiking trail at sunset, and how Sophie had been there and had helped Marcus carry the ring box in her little jacket pocket. I cried too because Claire was happy, and because I loved my daughter, and because a part of me desperately wanted to be wrong about this man. I was not wrong. 2 weeks after the engagement, Marcus called me directly. He had never called me directly before. He said he wanted to take me to lunch, just the two of us, to talk about the future. We met at a restaurant in Bozeman, a nice one, which I think was a calculated choice. He was warm and attentive and paid for everything. And then, over coffee, he told me that he had been doing some thinking. He said that with the wedding coming up, and with Claire and Sophie becoming his family, he felt a real responsibility to make sure everyone was protected. He said he'd been reading about estate planning and family trusts. He said he thought it might make sense, from a purely practical standpoint, for the property and certain other assets to be moved into a joint family trust. Him, Claire, and me, so that nothing gets complicated if something happens. I looked at him across that table for a long moment. I said, "That's very thoughtful. Let me talk to my attorney." He smiled. "Of course, no pressure. I just want to take care of this family." I called Patricia from the parking lot before I even started my car. I read her my notes from the lunch, word for word. There was a pause on her end, and then she said, "He's trying to get access to the assets before the wedding, not after. Be careful, Dorothy." I already knew that. But hearing it said out loud by someone else made something settle in me. A cold, clear kind of certainty. The hardest part of what followed was not protecting myself. The hard part was protecting Claire without destroying her happiness before I had proof of something she would actually believe. My daughter is loyal and loving, and she trusts the people she loves. Telling her, "I have a bad feeling about this man," was not going to work. I had learned that lesson once before, years earlier, in a situation with someone Claire had dated briefly. I had expressed doubts and it had damaged our relationship for almost a year. I wasn't smart going to make that mistake again. So I waited. And I watched. And I kept taking notes. The moment that changed everything came 6 weeks before the wedding. Claire called me, and something in her voice was different. Tighter. She said Marcus had suggested, again, gently, the way he always did everything, that perhaps it would be a good idea for the three of them to meet with a new attorney together. One Marcus knew, to streamline the paperwork before the wedding. He had mentioned that combining finances and property holdings ahead of a marriage was just what responsible people do. There was a pause in the conversation. And then Claire said, very quietly, "Mom, he keeps bringing it up, the property, your accounts. I don't know why." I closed my eyes. I said, "Claire, I need you to listen to me very carefully." We talked for 2.5 hours that night. I read her the notebook, every date, every comment, every question about the property, the fence lines, the financial advisor, the family trust. Claire was silent for most of it. When I finished, she didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, "I need to see it written down in front of me." I drove to Billings the next morning with the notebook and printed copies of 2 emails Marcus had sent me directly, the one about the financial advisor in Denver and one about the trust, which he had followed up in writing after our lunch, which I think he did because he wanted a paper trail that looked like he was being helpful. Claire sat at her kitchen table and read everything twice. Sophie was at school. The house was very quiet. When Claire looked up, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She said, "What do I do?" I said, "You don't do anything yet. We find out who he really is first." I hired an investigator. His name was Thomas, and he had been recommended by Patricia, and he was quiet and thorough, and he sent me his first report 11 days later. What he found was not a crime. Not exactly, not yet. But it was a pattern. Marcus had been engaged once before, 4 years earlier, to a woman in Colorado who was a decade older than him and who owned commercial property outside of Denver. The engagement had ended abruptly, and the woman had subsequently discovered that Marcus had, during their engagement, used access to her files to pull property records and contact her lenders directly. Nothing prosecutable had happened, but she had hired her own attorney and cut ties quickly enough to avoid real damage. She had not filed a police report because she couldn't prove intent. She had simply walked away. Thomas also found that Marcus's commercial real estate consulting firm had no registered employees other than himself, no significant transaction history in the past 3 years, and an address that turned out to be a shared mailbox service in downtown Denver. I sat with this information for 3 days before I told Claire. I needed to think about how to present it, how to give her time to process, and most importantly, I needed to understand what Claire wanted to do, because this was her life and her daughter's life, and I was not going to make her decisions for her. When I showed Claire the investigator's report, she read it slowly, twice, the same way she had read the notebook. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen sink, and stood there looking out the window for a long time. Sophie was in the backyard. We could see her through the glass, turning slow circles in the grass for no reason at all, the way small children do. Claire said, "He was going to use Sophie too, wasn't he? Sophie's name was going to be on whatever trust he set up." I said, "Yes, I think so." She turned around. Her face was calm in a way that was harder to look at than tears. She said, "I want him to know that I know. I want him to know in front of people." I understood that. I did not try to talk her out of it. I did suggest that we involve Patricia and the investigator, that we plan carefully, and that we pick a moment where Marcus could not simply deny everything and walk away. Claire agreed. The engagement party had already been scheduled for the following Saturday, a gathering at her home, 30-some guests, family and close friends. Claire had organized it herself. She decided to let it proceed exactly as planned. I spent the week before that party making sure everything was in order. I had already spoken with Patricia about the legal steps Claire would need to take to end the engagement and ensure her own financial documents were protected. I made sure Claire had her own copies of everything. I made sure Sophie's school counselor was quietly informed that Sophie might need some extra support in the coming weeks, without going into detail. I thought about the things that could go wrong, and I planned for each of them. The party was on a Saturday afternoon in late September. The leaves had just started to turn, and the light was the particular amber color that only happens in Montana in the fall. 33 people were there, Claire's closest friends, a few colleagues from her school, our family. Marcus stood near the kitchen holding a drink, working the room the way he was very good at doing. His smile was wide. His eyes were busy. I was standing with Claire's oldest friend, Renee, when I felt my phone vibrate. It was a text from Claire. Just 4 words. "Ready when you are." I looked across the room and found her. She was standing near the back door, and Sophie was beside her, and Claire's hand was resting on Sophie's shoulder. Claire looked at me, and her face was completely steady. I walked to where Marcus was standing. I said his name. He turned with a smile already in place. I said, "I'd like to say something to the room, if you don't mind." Something moved behind his eyes, just a flicker. He said, "Of course." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room went quiet on its own when people sensed that something was happening. I spoke for about 6 minutes. I told the room what I had noticed and when. I told them about the property questions, the financial advisor suggestion, the trust proposal, the attorney he had wanted us all to meet together. I told them about Thomas's report, the previous engagement in Colorado, the woman who had nearly lost her property, the consulting firm with no employees and a mailbox address. I told them that I had spent the last several months making very sure that my estate was protected and that Patricia had helped me ensure that nothing Marcus had proposed or suggested would ever be possible. I did not raise my voice. I did not name call. I simply stated what I knew, in the order I had learned it, the way Patricia had coached me to do, factually, clearly, without drama, because the facts themselves were dramatic enough. Marcus said nothing for the first 3 minutes. Then he started to speak, and his voice was the one I had never heard before, the one without the warmth in it. He said I was confused. He said I was a grieving widow who had become paranoid. He said I was trying to sabotage his relationship with Claire because I couldn't accept that she had moved on. The room was very quiet. Claire stepped forward. She had a folder in her hand. She set it on the kitchen counter, open, so that the first page of Thomas's report was visible. She said one sentence. "I have the report. Anyone who wants to read it is welcome to. Two of her friends stepped forward immediately. Marcus looked at the folder, he looked at Claire, he looked at me, and I watched something happen in his face that I don't have quite the right word for. A collapse, but not emotional, more like structural, like a building when the supports go at once. He left without another word. He walked out the back door and he was gone, and the room was absolutely silent until Renee began to cry quietly, and then several other people started talking at once, and Sophie tugged at Claire's sleeve and asked if the party was still happening. Claire looked down at her daughter and said, "Yes, baby, the party's still happening." That was 4 months ago. Marcus did not contest anything, legally or otherwise. I believe Thomas's report made that inadvisable. Claire filed the paperwork to end the engagement the following Monday, and Patricia handled everything on my end with characteristic efficiency. Marcus has not contacted either of us since the day he walked out that door. There are things I want you to take away from this, if you're listening. The first time someone asks about your property, you can call it curiosity. The second time, pay attention. The third time, write it down. Trust is not the same as blindness. Loving someone does not mean suspending your judgment about the people in their life. Claire's happiness mattered more to me than almost anything, but her safety mattered more than her happiness. There is a difference, and knowing that difference is one of the things that comes with having lived long enough. Keep your own documents, know what you own, have an attorney you trust completely, and make sure your estate is arranged the way you want it, not the way someone who smiles with only half their face wants it to be. Gerald built that front walkway one stone at a time. I watched him do it. I used to bring him water and sit on the porch steps and watch him work. And he never rushed, and every stone sits level to this day. Some things are worth protecting that carefully. You'll know which things they are. Sophie still turns slow circles in the backyard for no reason at all. Claire is teaching 3rd grade and she's going to be fine. And I am 67 years old, living in a house in Montana with 14 acres and a well-made front walkway. And I am telling you this because someone should.